The morning of our anniversary, I found my wife stacking boxes by the front door. No fight, no warning, just boxes. "We've grown apart," she said, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. 2 months. That's how long she waited after my layoff. 6 figures gone, and her clock started. Her mother pulled into the driveway to help load the car. "For 10 years, I've funded every studio, every launch, every 'this one's different, babe.'" She never once asked what I wanted. I held the brass key my father left me and felt it turn cold in my palm. I didn't shout. I asked for 60 seconds. Then I told her why I'd stayed so calm. And "grown apart" became a sentence she'd regret starting. I'm Miles. I'm 33. And the woman stacking those boxes had spent 10 years certain she knew exactly what I was worth, right down to the dollar. She was about to learn she'd never known me at all. Let me back up to that morning, because the boxes weren't the shock. The shock was how ordinary she made it look. I came downstairs at 7. Sloan already had her coffee, the good mug, the one with the gold rim she bought on a trip I paid for. She had 4 boxes taped shut and labeled in her neat handwriting: kitchen, bath, studio, closet. She'd been up early. She'd been planning. "Morning," she said, like it was any Thursday. I looked at the boxes, then at her, then at the calendar magnet on the fridge, the one with a little heart drawn around today's date in her pen. July 11th. 8 years married, 10 years together. She'd circled it herself back in the spring, before any of this started. "You want to tell me what this is?" I said. "I think you already know." She set the mug down. Ring off. Bare finger. A pale band where the gold used to sit. "We've grown apart, Miles. I've felt it for a while. I can't keep pretending." Grown apart. 2 words delivered soft like she was doing me a kindness. I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence unsettles people who've rehearsed a speech. She waited for me to argue, to raise my voice, to do the thing that would let her call me difficult later. I didn't give it to her. Instead, I noticed things. The boxes marked studio meant she was taking the equipment from a business I'd bankrolled to the last dollar. Her phone lay face down on the counter, buzzing, then buzzing again. And out the front window, a silver Lexus rolled up the drive. Her mother, Diane, in sunglasses at 7 in the morning, already here to help. Sloan had timed this to the day. Our anniversary. She wanted the date to mean something when she remembered it later. A little blade tucked inside a memory. "You picked today on purpose," I said. She had the decency to look away. "Don't make it uglier than it is." That was the moment I understood I wasn't in a conversation. I was in an ambush, and she believed I'd walked into it blind. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that I'd watched the shape of it coming for weeks. And I'd used every one of those weeks. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," Sloan said. "It'll be cleaner if you don't fight it." Cleaner. She wanted it clean, and she wanted me not to fight. Because a man who doesn't fight also doesn't look. Here's the part she got wrong about me, the part everyone always got wrong. They thought calm meant weak. My whole life, calm has meant I'm counting. Sit down for a second, I said. "Coffee's still warm." "Miles, there's nothing to—" 60 seconds, then your mother can start on the boxes." I pulled out a chair, not a demand, an invitation with a floor under it. "You've had months to plan this morning. Give me 1 minute of it." She glanced at the window at Diane climbing out of the Lexus. And something in her calculated that 1 minute was cheaper than a scene. She sat on the edge of the chair, the way you sit when you don't plan to stay. 60 seconds. I didn't start yet. I let her wait. And while she waited, the phone on the counter buzzed a 3rd time, and she reached over and turned it fully dark. And that small, quick motion told me almost everything I needed. You don't silence a phone in front of a husband you've grown apart from. You silence it in front of a husband you're leaving for someone else. I want to tell you what those 60 seconds became because it's the whole story. But you won't feel any of it unless you understand 2 things first: where I come from and how this marriage was actually built. So let me take you back, just a little, and I promise I'll get us to the porch, and to the reason a jobless man could stand there so calm it frightened his own wife. Before I do, though, if this is already sitting on your chest, take 1 second to like and subscribe. It genuinely pushes stories like this to the people who need to hear them tonight. And drop your city and the time it is where you are in the comments. I read every single one, and I like knowing where in the world someone's listening from. Now, back to how I got here. You can't understand me without my father, so I'll keep him short, the way he would have wanted. Raymond Lockhart was a machinist, 30 years at the same plant off Route 9, same lunch pail, same brown work coat, same seat at the kitchen table where I'm sitting now. He built this house on Cedar Lane with a second mortgage and his own weekends, and when people talked about him, they used one phrase, always the same one. Ray was a good provider. Not funny, not kind, not a man who loved old radios or told stories or hummed while he worked, though he did all of those. Just a good provider. He dropped dead at 58 in this driveway, still in his work coat, the week before he was going to retire. I was 21. I stood at his grave and listened to a foreman call my father a good provider one more time into a cold wind, and something set into me that morning and never fully melted. I made 2 promises at that grave. I would provide, and I would never let that be the only thing anyone could say when they buried me. I only ever kept the first one. He left me this house, free and clear, the one thing he finished paying off before he died, and a brass key on a worn leather fob. I've carried it 12 years. It was in my hand that anniversary morning, and I need you to hold on to it too, because that key becomes the truth of the whole thing later. I met Sloan 3 years after the funeral. I was 23, freshly promoted, still wearing grief like a coat I couldn't get off. She was 21, luminous, and she looked at me like I was a door into a bigger room. I mistook being wanted for being loved. A lot of us do. I don't say it to be cruel to her or to myself. I say it because it's the hinge everything else swings on. Here's the shape the marriage took, and I only saw it whole much later. I earned, and she spent it becoming someone new every couple of years. First a boutique, then a wellness studio, then a candle line, an online shop, an interior design pivot she named Maison Sloan. Each one launched on my money with my name on the paperwork. Each one folded quietly inside 2 years, and each time, before it folded, she'd stand right here in this kitchen and say, "This one's different, babe. This is the one." I signed the studio lease. I signed the line of credit when the studio bled out. I co-signed the SUV, my name every time, because my credit was the strong one, because I was the provider, because that was the arrangement, even though nobody ever said the word out loud. I told myself it was partnership. It took losing my job to show me it was a subscription, and she was about to cancel it. Now here's the second cliffhanger she never guessed I was standing on, and it's the whole reason I could sit across from her that morning without my hands shaking. The layoff wasn't the day my life ended. It was the day I started reading it carefully, and I did not like what the pages said. The layoff hit the first week of May, a Tuesday. Harmon Medical Supply got swallowed by a bigger distributor. And the bigger distributor didn't need 2 directors of regional operations. It kept the one who golfed with the new VP. I got 4-month severance, a cardboard box, and a handshake in a glass room where everyone could watch. I drove home slow that day. I thought about my father in this same driveway, in his coat, and I was almost grateful he wasn't alive to watch his son carry a box up the walk. I told Sloan that night at dinner, I've turned this moment over more times than any other because it's the one where I finally saw her. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what happened. She set down her fork and she looked at me the exact way you look at a car that won't turn over on a cold morning. And she said, "So what does that mean for us? Financially." Us. Financially. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "We'll figure it out." Just, "What does this do to the money?" "Severance covers 4 months," I said. "I've already got feelers out. I'll land something." She nodded slowly. She didn't reach across the table. She didn't touch my hand. She said, "You should probably cancel the Nashville trip we talked about, and maybe pause the club membership." And then she went to bed early, and I sat at this table with the plates still out, and I understood with a terrible clarity that I had married someone who saw me the precise way that Foreman saw my father. A good provider, nothing underneath worth keeping once the providing stopped. I said none of that out loud. I've never been a man who makes a scene. But that night is when the calm actually began. Not peace, counting. So before I tell you what I did the next morning, I want you to guess, genuinely. A man comes home with a box and his wife's first question is what it means financially. What does he do the very next day? Say it out loud or drop it in the comments before I show you. Most people guess he begged or spiraled or fought for his old job. Most people guess wrong. The morning after that dinner, I made 2 phone calls, and neither one was to my old boss. The first was to my brother Wesley, 4 years older, runs a small contracting crew, hands like sandpaper, the only person alive who ever told me the truth about Sloan and paid for it. 2 summers back, at a barbecue right here in this yard, he watched her send me back and forth for the shrimp platter like a waiter, and afterward he said quietly, "She married the paycheck, Miles. I hope you know that." I didn't speak to him for a month. He was right, and I couldn't stand that he was right, and I punished him for it. I called him, and I said, "I think you were right about her." And my brother, and I love him for this, didn't say I told you so. He said, "Come over tonight. Bring nothing. We'll figure it out." That's who Wesley is. He builds things. He doesn't tear people down. He just refuses to help them lie to themselves. The second call was to Nora Callahan. Nora's a recruiter I've known 6 years, the sharp kind who remembers everybody's name and every job they ever hated. Back in March, 2 months before the layoff, when the acquisition was just a whisper on the sales floor, I'd quietly told her to keep an ear open for me. I'm not a man who waits for the roof to cave. My father taught me that much before anything else. You watch the ceiling. You look for the stain before the water comes through. So when I called Nora the morning after that dinner, she already had something warm. A regional distributor down in Nashville, Ridgeline Medical, hunting for a VP of operations. More money than Harmon ever paid me. Relocation package. A whole city where not one living soul would ever call me a single thing my father got called. "They want to move fast," Nora said. "Can you interview next week?" "I can interview tomorrow," I said. I went to Wesley's that night, like he asked. He lives 20 minutes out, a small brick ranch he gutted and rebuilt with his own hands. Every room in it proof that a man's worth can be measured in something other than a paycheck. He had 2 folding chairs pulled up to the workbench in his garage, a space heater ticking away, and he didn't make me talk until I was ready. "So," he finally said, turning a chisel over in his hands, "the paperwork you signed for her, all of it in your name." "All of it." He nodded slowly. "And the house." "Dad's, mine before her, paid off." He set the chisel down. "Then you're not drowning, Miles. You just think you are because she's been telling you the water's up to your neck for 10 years. He looked at me steady. "Here's the thing nobody says out loud. A woman who married your paycheck isn't going to hang around to watch it shrink. That's not a tragedy that's about to happen to you. That's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how sad you are about it." I told him about the 2 questions at dinner. Us. Financially. He didn't so much as blink. "You want my advice, or you want me to be angry for you?" "Both." "The angry part's free. I've been angry since the shrimp." That pulled half a laugh out of me. The first one in weeks. "The advice costs you something, though. You have to stop reacting. You react, you lose. She's counting on you to blow up so she can tell the whole town you're unstable, and she was so brave to leave. Don't hand her that story. Get quiet. Get your papers in a row. And when the day comes, don't argue with her. Just show her the floor she's actually standing on and let her feel it move under her." I've turned that sentence over more than any other from that whole spring. Don't argue. Show her the floor. "One more thing," Wesley said, walking me back to the truck. "When you land the next job, and you will, you're the most capable person I know, and that includes me. Don't tell her. Don't use it to buy her back. A man who wins his wife back with a bigger paycheck just proves she was right about him all along. You hear me?" "I hear you." "Good. Now go sleep in Dad's house. It's paid for. That's more than most men our age can say." I drove home through the dark, past the plant off Route 9 where my father gave 30 years of his life, and I did the one thing my brother told me to do. I got quiet. The interviews with Ridgeline turned out to be the strangest part of that whole spring, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I stood in a room full of people evaluating me, and not one of them cared what I was worth to a woman. They cared what I could build. The second interview was a full day at their Nashville headquarters. 6 people across a long table, distribution maps on the wall, real problems half solved on a whiteboard. They walked me through a supply chain bottleneck that had been bleeding them money for a year, and somewhere in the middle of it, I stood up without being asked and started fixing it on the board, out loud, the way my mind runs when nobody's watching. When I finished, the man who'd become my boss, a broad, easy guy named Hollis, leaned back, looked at me a second and said, "Where have you been? Where have you been? Not what's your number, not what do you make. Where have you been?" Like I was something they'd been missing. I'd love to tell you I stayed cool. I didn't. I had to look down at my notes for a moment because my eyes did something I hadn't planned, and I was grateful the table was long enough that no one caught it. 12 years I'd carried the quiet certainty that the finest thing anyone would ever say over me was that I paid the bills on time. And here was a room of strangers looking at the way my mind worked like it was worth flying 500 miles to sit across from. I flew home that night to a wife who'd stopped touching my hand, the offer still just a warmth in the air, and I sat in the window seat somewhere over Kentucky and thought, I live in 2 rooms now. One where I'm a checkbook running low on ink, and one where I'm the answer to a question a company's been asking for a year. And I already knew which room I was going to walk into for good. I need you to hold the timeline exactly because Sloan never had it, and the timeline is the knife. I lost my job the first week of May. I interviewed with Ridgeline the second week of May. And in the third week of May, driving home from a second interview, feeling something like hope for the first time in a year, I collected the mail at the end of the drive and found a certified letter. My wife had filed for divorce, not raised it, not asked for counseling, not sat me down. Filed, petition drawn, submitted to the county, a case number, the works. The date stamped on the filing was May 19th, which meant she'd started the paperwork within days of my layoff. Before my first interview, before I'd sent out a single resume she knew about. 11 days after I carried a box up the walk, she'd hired a lawyer. She hadn't grown apart from me. She'd run the numbers the night I came home empty-handed, and she'd decided the asset was depreciating, and she'd moved to sell before it dropped further. I sat in my car in this driveway, the driveway where my father died, in front of the house he left me, holding a certified letter with my wife's name on the petitioner line. And I did not cry, and I did not storm inside. I folded the letter into the glove box, and I made myself a promise as cold and smooth as that brass key. You want it clean and quiet? Fine, clean and quiet, but on my terms, at my time, and not one word from me until I know everything. That's the thing most people get wrong at that exact moment, and it's why they lose. They react, they scream, they text, they lay their whole hand across a table so the other person can build a defense. I'd watched my father react to bad news his whole life, a bill, a layoff scare, a blown transmission, and I'd watched the reacting take years off him. I wasn't going to react, I was going to read. The date on that filing was the first card I slipped into my pocket, May 19th. Remember it, because on the porch it does more damage than anything else I say. I want to be honest about the weeks in between though, because if I only tell you the parts where I was calm and clever, I'll have lied to you, and lying is the one thing this whole story is against. Living in that house through June was its own kind of education, because Sloan, believing I was a gutted, jobless man who'd sign whatever she put in front of me, stopped bothering to be kind, and what came out from under the kindness told me more than any document. She started narrating my failure out loud. "Have you even applied anywhere today?" she'd ask, standing in the kitchen doorway while I sat with my laptop, not knowing I'd already signed nothing yet, only because I was choosing my moment. Because Grant said the market's actually strong right now, if a person's willing to hustle, Grant said. She let his name slip like that, casual, testing whether I'd catch it. I didn't blink. I filed it. She canceled our shared streaming accounts and moved them to a login I didn't have. Small thing, but she did it the way you'd repossess something. She told her friends, I heard it secondhand from Wesley's wife, who still ran into that circle, that Miles has kind of given up, that she was carrying the emotional weight of the household. Me, who'd carried the actual weight of it for a decade. That was the version going around, the industrious wife dragging a defeated husband. Here's what I want you to sit with, because it's the part that took me longest to accept. None of that was random cruelty. It was a woman building a story, a public story, in which leaving me was not just allowed, but noble. A story where she was brave and I was dead weight. She wasn't just leaving. She was writing the eulogy for our marriage in advance and casting herself as the survivor. Her mother taught her to do exactly that. And I'll come to Diane because Diane is the reason my wife could do this without a flicker of guilt. Let me show you 3 moments from that June because they're the ones that burned the last of my grief down to resolve. None of them is dramatic. That's the whole point. Cruelty at the end of a marriage rarely shouts. It just stops bothering to hide. The first was a party. Sloane's friends threw one of those garden evenings she loved. String lights, a charcuterie board photographed before anyone was allowed to touch it. I almost stayed home. I went because staying home would have been one more line in her story about me. And halfway through the night, standing in a little circle with 3 of her friends and their husbands, someone asked me the polite, harmless question. "So, Miles, what's next for you, job-wise?" Before I could open my mouth, Sloane laughed. Light, social, the kind of laugh that carries across a yard. "Oh, Miles is taking some time to find himself," she said. "We're all being very patient with him." She squeezed my arm. Everyone chuckled. The conversation moved on, and I stood there holding a plastic cup while my wife introduced my unemployment as a character flaw to a circle of people who'd remember it. I didn't correct her. I could have. I already had 2 interviews behind me by then and a third on the calendar. I could have said, "Actually, I'm in final rounds for a vice presidency in Nashville," and watched her face rearrange itself in real time. But Wesley's voice was in my head. "Don't hand her the story." So I smiled, and I sipped my drink, and I let her mistake my silence for defeat. It was the most expensive thing I never said. The second moment came a week later. I found a document on the kitchen counter, printed and paper-clipped, a sticky note stuck to the top in her neat handwriting. "Just makes everything simpler. Can you sign?" It was a quitclaim deed. On the house. My father's house. She'd had a form drawn up transferring an interest in the property, dressed as a formality, betting a demoralized man would sign anything with the word simpler attached to it. She had no idea I'd already pulled the deed, already talked to Ruth, already knew the exact ground it stood on. I looked at that sticky note for a long time. Then I left the document exactly where it lay, unsigned. And I never said a word about it. And neither did she. Because to mention it, she'd have had to admit what she'd tried to do. That's the moment I stopped grieving. If you want the honest truth, you can grieve a marriage. You cannot grieve a person who slides a paper across the counter to sign away your dead father's house and calls it simpler. The third moment I didn't see coming, and it's the one that told me she'd already moved out in every way but the boxes. I logged into our joint savings to shift some money for the property taxes. Force of habit. And I saw that $11,000 had drained out over the previous month in small, careful transfers into an account I didn't recognize. Not stolen exactly. It was marital money, and she had every right to touch it, but moved quietly. The way you move things off a ship you already know is going down. I didn't confront her. No scene, no accusation. I called Ruth, told her the dates and the amounts, and Ruth said, "Note it. It won't help her in the settlement. And it tells you everything about where her head is." And it did. More than the money. It was the confirmation. My wife wasn't leaving. She'd already left. She'd been packing for months. First the money, then the story, and eventually the boxes. The anniversary was only the day she'd chosen to make me watch. And then, near the end of June, she and her mother tried it together, which was the closest they came to open war. I came home to find both of them in the kitchen, waiting. The way you set a room before a conversation you intend to win. Diane at the table, Sloane leaning against the counter, arms folded. "We think it would be healthier if you moved out," Sloane said. "Until things are final." Grant said, "A friend of mine said it's cleaner when the man goes." Grant said, I repeated mild. Her jaw tightened, just barely. "A friend." "It's my house," I said. "Bought before you, left to me by my father. I'm not going anywhere." Diane leaned in, and she brought out the creed like a closing argument. A man who loved his wife would give her space instead of clinging to a pile of bricks. But then, a man is what he provides, and you're not providing much these days. So I suppose bricks are all you've got left. She smiled. "Be a gentleman for once. Leave." I looked at the two of them, mother and daughter, the teacher and the star pupil, standing in my father's kitchen trying to talk me out of the one thing that was actually, legally, wholly mine, and I felt the last of my sadness turn into something clean and quiet and load-bearing. "No," I said, "just that." And I went upstairs and I heard them talking low in the kitchen for a long time, and I let them plan because, let me tell you something I'd learned by then. When two people are certain they've already beaten you, they stop hiding their hand. I just kept watching it. But first, I did 3 quiet things through June, and none of them was a trick. Each one was just a man reading his own life carefully for the first time in his life. The first thing I did was pull the deed to the house. You'd think I'd know my own deed by heart. The truth is, I hadn't looked at it since probate, since the worst week of my 20s. I drove to the county recorder's office and paid $9 for a certified copy, and I read it standing right there at the counter with strangers filing forms on either side of me. The house on Cedar Lane came to me by inheritance from the estate of Raymond Lockhart in 2014, 2 full years before I married Sloan, titled in my name alone. No refinance, no quitclaim, nothing that ever added her name across 8 years of marriage. No mortgage. My father paid it off before he died, the one finish line he crossed clean. I called Ruth Donnelly that afternoon. Ruth's the plain-spoken attorney who handled my father's estate, 60-some years old. No wasted words. I asked her one question. In Ohio, if I inherited the house before the marriage and never put her on the title, is it hers to split? Separate property, Ruth said, flat as a weather report. Inheritance is separate. Premarital is separate. No mortgage means no marital funds paid it down, so nothing commingled. She has no claim on that house, Miles. None. The house Sloan assumed she'd walk off with, or get bought out of, or hold over my head, the house she'd redecorated 3 separate times on my dime, was never on the table. She just didn't know it, and I was not going to be the one to tell her early. Second card in my pocket, next to the date. I want to stay on that deed one more moment, because standing at that counter did something to me I hadn't expected. I'd walked in treating it like a chore. Pull the paper, confirm the facts, arm myself. But reading my father's name in the flat legal type of a county record, Raymond Lockhart, grantor, I had to lay my hand flat on the counter to steady myself. He'd left me the house in 2014, dying in a hospital bed, filling out forms with a hand that already shook. I'd assumed at the time it was simply what fathers do. You pass the house down. But standing there 12 years later, I understood it was more deliberate than that. My father had watched me my whole childhood learn exactly one way to be a man. His way. Provide and provide and provide. And maybe some part of him knew what a trap that could become. So he made sure that whatever happened to me, whatever job I lost, whatever woman looked at me and saw only a number, I would always have one thing that was mine alone, that no marriage and no market and no lawyer could ever touch. A roof, his roof, in my name, before any of it. He couldn't teach me I was more than a provider. He didn't have the words. Nobody ever handed them to him either. But he could build me a floor to stand on for the day someone finally proved they only wanted the checks. And he did. A machinist who called himself nothing but a good provider reached out from a hospital bed and protected his son from the exact fate he'd lived and died inside of. I paid my $9. I took my certified copy, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of the recorder's office and cried for the first time in the whole ordeal. Not over Sloan, not over the marriage, over my father. Over the fact that the man everyone reduced to a paycheck had, in the end, given me the one thing that would let me refuse to be reduced the same way. That isn't what a provider does. That's what a father does. And I'd spent 12 years too deep in my own grief to see the difference. Then I dried my face and I drove home and I slid the deed into the manila envelope and I kept counting. But something had shifted in me. I wasn't only protecting myself anymore. I was finishing something my father had started. The second thing I did was harder to look at than the deed, because it wasn't about her. It was about me. I took the plain manila envelope where I keep documents, and I laid out every financial obligation with both our names on it, across this same kitchen table, one night while she was out at what she called a client dinner. And for the first time in 10 years, I saw the actual architecture of our life. The studio lease. My name, personal guarantee. The bank wouldn't accept hers, and I'd signed without a second thought. The line of credit keeping Maison Sloan's lights on, $82,000, my name, my signature. The SUV in the driveway, my cosign, the payment drafting from my account every month. The credit cards she called hers, authorized user, all on my accounts. I added it up under the kitchen light while the refrigerator hummed, and I saw it plain. Everything that made Sloan look like Sloan. The storefront, the leased car, the lifestyle that photographed so beautifully rested on exactly one signature, mine. The day I stopped, all of it came down. Not because I'd yank a lever out of spite, because there was no lever. There was only me, holding it up, and me, someday, letting go. That's a strange thing to learn about your own marriage, that you were the foundation, and your wife believed she was the house. And this is where the calm cracked the first time. I want to tell you about it, because a man who never breaks isn't strong. He's just lying. I sat at my father's table in my father's house with an envelope in front of me that proved I had become the one thing I swore at his grave I'd never be reduced to. A provider, and only a provider, to the single person who was supposed to see the rest. And I put my head in my hands, and I asked the empty room the question I'd never once let myself ask in 10 years of marriage. Did anybody ever want me for anything but the checks I wrote? The room didn't answer. The refrigerator hummed. The brass key sat on the table where I'd set it, catching the light. And after a while, I picked it up, and I put it back in my pocket, and I stood up, because that's the whole trick of it. You break for 1 minute, in private, where no one can hand you that look. Then you get up, and you keep counting. The third thing I didn't go looking for. It came and found me on a Sunday in June. Sloan was in the shower, and her phone lit up on the nightstand. Face up, 18 inches from my head. I wasn't hunting for it. And a message banner slid across the glass. A man's name, Grant. And beneath it, 4 words I can still see when I close my eyes. Told my partners you're basically single already. Basically single already. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. I lay there in the gray morning light and let the pieces settle into place with an almost surgical quiet. The client dinners, the new highlights in her hair, the way she'd stopped fighting with me sometime in spring and started managing me instead. The way you manage a house you're about to sell. She wasn't leaving because we'd grown apart. She was leaving for a specific man, on a specific schedule, and she'd been running his timeline right alongside mine for months. Grant, I learned the rest without much effort at all, because people who think they've already won get careless with the details. Grant Ashworth, a plastic surgeon she'd met through a Maison Sloan consultation. She'd pitched a redesign of his waiting room, 6 figures, of course. The kind of number that had, apparently, been the whole difference between we've grown apart and let's try counseling. She'd traded up, or she thought she had. She'd looked at the man who funded a decade of her dreams, decided the funding had dried, and lined up a man whose funding hadn't. Simple as swapping one card for another, with a higher limit. I want to be fair to myself here, because I didn't build my whole understanding of Grant on 4 words sliding across a phone screen. I confirmed it the boring way, the way you confirm anything. I paid attention. A week after that text, Sloan told me she had a late client meeting downtown at a restaurant I happened to know because we'd celebrated an anniversary there years back, in better days. I wasn't following her. I had my own dinner that night, with Wesley, at a place 2 doors down, planned before she ever mentioned hers. Coincidence has a cruel sense of timing. Walking to meet my brother, I passed the window, and there they were. Sloan and a tall man in an expensive jacket, her hand resting on his forearm, her head tipped back in a laugh I hadn't heard aimed at me in longer than I could count. No client folder on the table, no pitch deck, just 2 glasses of wine, a candle, and a woman who looked, for the first time in a year, genuinely happy. I didn't go in. I didn't slow down. I met my brother, I ordered, and about halfway through the meal, I told him what I'd seen through the glass. Wesley set down his fork. Everyone in my life sets down their fork at the worst possible moments. And he said, "You okay?" Strangely, yeah, I said. And I meant it, because seeing it was almost a relief. For 2 months, I'd carried a smaller, meaner suspicion that maybe I really was hard to love, that maybe the drifting was mutual and I'd just been too dense to feel it. That candle in the window closed the case. She hadn't drifted, she'd upgraded, and she'd lined up the upgrade while I was interviewing for the job that would have let us start over. There's a strange, cold peace in learning a thing was never your fault. Cold, but peace. Here's what she never accounted for. The thing that turned that calm porch into the worst morning of her year. Grant believed he was getting a woman with a business, a home, and assets. He was getting a woman with $82,000 of debt in my name, a lease she couldn't hold for a week without my signature, and a house that was never hers to bring anywhere. She'd cut the rope she thought was dragging her down. She had no idea it was the only rope holding her up. I could feel the shape of the ending forming by then. But I'm not going to pretend the road to that porch was a straight, cold line, because it wasn't. There was a week in late June where I nearly threw the whole thing away, and I'd be cheating you if I skipped it. The formal offer from Ridgeline came the last week of June. VP of Operations, Nashville. Start date the first week of August. A salary that made Harmon look like my first job out of school. Relocation covered. A signing bonus. I signed it in Nora's office, and she shook my hand and said, "Go land, Miles." And for about an hour, I felt like a whole man again, standing up straight in a lobby with sun coming through the glass. Then I drove home to a house that was already half a stranger's, to a wife who was already basically single, according to a surgeon named Grant, and the whole feeling drained out of me on Cedar Lane like water out of a cracked glass. I sat in the driveway, my father's driveway, the offer letter on the passenger seat, the certified petition still in the glove box, the brass key in my pocket, and I thought, what is the point of any of this? I win the argument. I keep the house. I take the job. And I'm still the man whose own wife looked at him the day his income stopped and started a stopwatch. I nearly called her right there, not to fight, to beg, to say we can fix this. I've got a new job, a big one. Come to Nashville with me, and let's start clean. I had the phone in my hand. I dialed 4 digits of a number I've known by heart for 10 years. And then I imagined her answer. I imagined telling her about the new salary, and I imagined the warmth flooding back into her voice. Not because she'd missed me, but because the asset had come back online, because the numbers had recovered. And I understood that if I made that call, and if she came back, I would spend the rest of my life being loved for my ledger. A good provider, the exact box they buried my father in, with me still breathing inside it. I hung up. I sat in the dark until the streetlight came on, and I made the last decision. The real one. The one that let me be so quiet on the porch that it scared her. I was not going to fight to keep her. I was going to let her go, but not on the lie. She did not get to rewrite 10 years into "we grew apart" and stroll out clean into a surgeon's waiting room while a story went around town that I'd given up. She was going to hear the truth once, out loud, in daylight, in front of the few people who happened to be standing there. And then I was going to be the one who left. Not revenge, I need to be clear about that, because this is exactly where people go wrong and turn into the thing they hated. I didn't burn her business down or blast her across the internet or cut up her clothes. I just stopped holding up the parts of her life that were only standing because of me, and I made sure that when she walked out that door, she walked out knowing precisely what she'd chosen and precisely what it cost. So I told Ruth to prepare a clean, factual response to the petition, asserting the house as separate property, declining any spousal support given both our earning histories and the decade I'd spent funding her ventures. I told Nora yes to Nashville, and I gave notice on the marriage in my own head. I let the studio's line of credit hit its ceiling, and I told the bank, quietly and in writing, that I would not renew my personal guarantee on the storefront lease when it came due July 31st. Not sabotage, just the end of a subscription I'd been paying for 10 years. And I said nothing to Sloan. I let her keep planning her clean, quiet exit. I let her keep the anniversary circled on the calendar. I let her believe, right up to the last minute, that I was a broken, jobless man who'd sign anything to make it stop. Which is what makes the middle of June worth one more scene, because Diane came by, and Diane is the whole engine underneath my wife. She came on a Saturday, uninvited, the way she's come into this house for 8 years without ever once knocking. 60 years old, sharp as a folded knife, sunglasses she doesn't take off indoors. She found me at the kitchen table with my laptop and no tie, and she looked at me like I was a stain on her daughter's future. "You're still here," she said, not hello. I'd have thought a man with any pride would have moved out by now and let her breathe. "It's my house, Diane." She laughed, short. "For now." And then she said the sentence she's built her whole life around. The sentence she raised Sloan on, the one I'd heard at Thanksgivings and at my own wedding disguised as a toast. "A man is what he provides, Miles. You forget that, and everything else you think you are goes right out the window." My daughter finally remembered it. Good for her. A man is what he provides. I looked at Diane in her sunglasses in my father's kitchen, and I felt the calm go very still and very clear. The way water goes clear when it finally stops moving, because I understood her, and understanding her was the last piece. Diane married for security at 20 and got left at 40 with nothing. And instead of learning that a ledger is a cold and lonely thing to build a life on, she learned the exact opposite. She learned that a woman must never, ever again be the one holding the short end of the ledger. She turned it into a religion, and she raised her only daughter as its most faithful practitioner. Sloan wasn't a monster. Sloan was a devout student of a hard creed, and she was doing to me precisely what her mother trained her to do the day the numbers turned. "You should go," I told Diane. "Sloan's not here." She stood, smoothed her slacks, paused at the door. "You always were sweet," she said, and she made it sound like an insult, which in her world it is. Sweet doesn't pay a mortgage. "This one's paid off," I said. She didn't catch it. She had no idea how much was inside that sentence. She left, and I watched the Lexus back out of the driveway where my father died, and I thought, your daughter is going to stand on this same porch in a few weeks and find out Sweet paid for everything you ever saw her wearing. I'd like to tell you the road from that decision to the porch ran smooth and certain. It didn't. 3 days before the anniversary, the floor I thought I'd secured dropped out from under me, and for about 36 hours, I believed I'd lost the whole thing. It started with a call from Ruth. I could hear it in her voice before she said a word, the careful tone lawyers use when the news isn't clean. "Their attorney sent a position letter," she said. "I want you to hear it from me before you spin out. They're making 2 arguments. First, they're claiming Maison Sloan was a marital business you both built, and that by letting the credit line max out and declining to renew the lease, you're deliberately destroying a marital asset. Dissipation, they're calling it. They want the studio's so-called value counted against you." "The studio never turned a profit in 5 years," I said. "It's $82,000 in the hole." "I know that. You know that. But arguing it costs time and money, and they're betting you don't want to spend either." She paused. "There's a second thing, and it's uglier. The mother's been busy. She's telling people around town, the kind of people who talk, that you drained the accounts and abandoned a wife who was building something, that you're a bitter man punishing a woman for leaving. It isn't true. But it's a story, and stories travel." I sat down on the bottom step of my father's stairs with the phone against my ear, and I felt something cold I hadn't felt since the certified letter. "Ruth, my new job, Ridgeline. If that story reaches them before I start, I know," she said gently. "I won't lie and tell you it can't. A background call, a mutual contact, a bad reference dressed up as a friendly warning. It's a risk, probably a small one, but it's real." I hung up and I sat on that step a long time. And here's the thing I have to be honest about, because I promised you I would. In that moment, I did not feel calm. I felt every warning my family ever gave me about her curdle into one sick thought. I'd been so careful, and she still might win. She might carve a slice of the debt-ridden studio out of my hide, drag it out a year, and poison the one clean thing I'd built for myself 500 miles away. The gold digger. Everyone had always called her, and the gold digger might just walk off with the last of the gold anyway, and my good name along with it. That was the low point. That night was the lowest I got. Because after Ruth's call, I went to hang up my good coat, the interview one, and I found something in the inside pocket I'd forgotten was there. An envelope, an anniversary card. I'd bought it back in April, before the layoff, before any of it, at a drugstore on my lunch break. And I'd written in it that same afternoon and slipped it in my coat to give her on July 11th. I'd forgotten it existed. I opened it, my own handwriting, from a man 3 months earlier who didn't know yet what was coming. 10 years, I'd sign up for 10 more without reading the fine print. Yours always, M. I'd sign up for 10 more without reading the fine print. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I finally let it come. The thing I'd been counting my way around for 2 months. Not the money, not the job, not the deed, just the plain human wound underneath all of it. I had loved her, badly maybe, and blindly, and in the only language I was ever taught. Provision, provision, provision. But I had loved her, and she had looked at the man who wrote that card and seen a line item. For a few minutes on that floor, with the card in one hand and Ruth's warning still in my ear, I wondered if my brother and my mother-in-law were both right in their opposite ways. Maybe a man really is just what he provides. Maybe I'd spent 33 years afraid of a headstone that only ever told the truth. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the kitchen to go dark around me. And then, I can't fully explain it, I thought about that long table in Nashville and a man named Hollis leaning back to ask, "Where have you been?" I thought about Wesley's garage and the chisel steady in his hands. I thought about a little brass key that opened a house nobody on earth could take from me because a man in a brown coat finished paying it off before he died, so his son would always have somewhere to stand. And I understood that the card in my hand was proof of the opposite of everything I feared. I had given more than money. I'd given 10 years of a real, dumb, hopeful heart. She just never learned to see it because her mother trained the sight right out of her before I ever met her. That wasn't a verdict on my worth. It was a verdict on hers. I got up off the floor. I called Ruth back the next morning, and I told her one thing. Don't settle a single dollar to make the story go away. If they want to argue the studio's a valuable asset, let them. And then let them explain to a judge why they also want support from the man who bankrolled a failing business for 5 years. Make them pick a lane, and if the story reaches Ridgeline, then it reaches them. I'll tell Hollis the truth to his face and let him decide what kind of man he thinks I am. I'm done being afraid of a story. Ruth was quiet a second. Then she said, "Good, that's the right answer. And for what it's worth, dissipation claims on a business that's been underwater for years go nowhere. They're bluffing, because bluffing is cheaper than a real case. Let them bluff into the wind." The story never did reach Ridgeline, or if it did, Hollis never once mentioned it, and I started on time. Diane's whisper campaign burned itself out the way small fires do when no one feeds them, because the people worth knowing don't build their measure of a man out of his mother-in-law's grievances. But I didn't know any of that yet. On the porch, 3 days later, I still carried the memory of that kitchen floor, and the card and the 36 hours I'd believe she might take everything I had. And maybe that's exactly why I could be so gentle when the moment finally came. When you've already stood at the very bottom and climbed back up by yourself, you don't need to shout from the top. There was one last thing I did the night before the anniversary, and I did it alone. I drove to the studio after dark. Maison Sloan in a strip of boutiques on the good side of town, the storefront I'd signed for, the lease I'd guaranteed, the $82,000 of borrowed light. I let myself in with my key. My name on everything, remember, even the alarm code. And I stood in the middle of a room I'd paid for 100 times over and had almost never entered. It was beautiful, and it was empty, and it had always been both. Curated shelves with almost nothing on them. A velvet couch nobody sat on, a neon sign that said she believed she could, in looping pink cursive, humming faintly, running on my credit line. I stood there, and I understood the whole marriage in one glance. This was the house Sloan thought she lived in, and I'd been the current in the wire the entire time, keeping the sign lit so she could stand under it and feel like someone. I boxed the studio equipment myself that night, carefully, no spite. Folding tissue between the fragile things the way you would for someone you'd once loved. I turned off the neon sign last. It flickered and went dark, and the room went to shadow, and I locked the door behind me for the final time. On the drive home, I called the bank's after-hours line and left the message I'd been putting off, made it official in my own voice. I would not be renewing the guarantee. The lease would die on the 31st. The current was off. The sign would not come back on. Which brings us all the way back to July 11th, the 4 boxes by the door, the mother in the driveway again, the bare band on my wife's finger, the buzzing phone she turned dark, and me at the kitchen table having offered her 60 seconds she was too impatient to refuse. I'd rehearsed nothing. I want you to know that. I'm not a speech giver. I just had the truth, in order, and a minute I intended to spend well. Before I could start, Diane came in without knocking, the way she always has. She saw me sitting there, not helping load, and she said it a 4th and final time, right on cue, like she was reading from the only book she owns. Don't just sit there, Miles. A man is what he provides, and lately you're not providing much. Sloan winced, not at the cruelty, at the timing, because even she could feel her mother handing me a thread to pull, but the thread was already in my hand. Let's go outside, I said, standing. You wanted to load the car. Let's do it on the porch, in the daylight, where your mother and your ride can hear. It'll be cleaner. I used her word back to her, gently. Clean and quiet. That's what you wanted. She should have said no. But saying no would have meant she was afraid of 60 seconds from a jobless man and Diane was watching. And pride is a lever that works on the proud. She picked up the first box, marked Studio, and carried it out onto the porch. And I followed her into the hot July morning. And that's when I saw the audience the day had assembled for me. And I couldn't have arranged it better if I'd tried. A second car had pulled in behind the Lexus, a dark gray Audi, gleaming, the exact car a plastic surgeon drives. Grant had come to help his basically single girlfriend move out of her husband's house on her husband's anniversary. He got out, tall, easy, his own sunglasses, a man who'd been told this was the simple part of the plan. And next door, old Mr. Alvarez had stopped watering his roses. He's watered those roses every summer morning for 30 years. He knew my father. He'd waved at Ray in that brown coat 1,000 times. He stood at the property line, hose dripping, watching openly, because there's no privacy on a porch in July, and every soul on Cedar Lane could see 4 boxes and a marriage ending in plain sun. 4 witnesses, my wife, her mother, her surgeon, and a man who'd known the one who built this house. Not a ballroom, a porch. It was more than enough. Sloan set the box down at her own feet on the porch boards, and she crossed her arms, and she gave me the look you give a man you've already filed and sealed. Fine, she said. 60 seconds, then Grant and I are loading the car. I want to walk you through those 60 seconds slowly, the way they actually happened, because I've never told them start to finish, and because the order is the whole thing. You don't win a moment like this. You reveal it, one layer at a time. You told me we've grown apart, I said. I want to make sure I have the timeline right in my head, because the petition you filed is dated May 19th. Her arms tightened across her chest. So I lost my job this first week of May. You filed on the 19th. That's not 2 people drifting for years, Sloan. That's 11 days. I kept my voice level, the same level my father kept his voice when the transmission blew on the highway, and he still had to get us home. You didn't grow apart from me. You ran the numbers the night I walked in with a box, and 11 days later you had a lawyer. You can call it anything you need to call it, but you and I both know what the date says. That's not fair, she said, and her eyes cut sideways. To Grant, to her mother, checking her audience. People need time to realize things. I'd been unhappy. You realized it in 11 days, I said. That's the first thing I wanted on the record, in front of the people you're going to tell your version to. 11 days. That's wave 1. She lied. Grown apart. I laid down the date. She denied. That's not fair. I'd been unhappy. And I didn't argue the feeling. I just set the calendar between us and let it sit, because you can argue with a feeling forever, but a date doesn't move. Diane stepped up onto the porch, heels sharp on the old boards my father laid. She doesn't owe you a timeline. What she owes, you owe her. Half of everything. This house, the accounts, the equity, that's how it works in a marriage, Miles, whether it wounds your pride or not. She smiled, thin and certain. A man is what he provides. So provide her the exit she's earned and stop embarrassing yourself. And there it was, the creed, one more time, walking her straight into wave 2 without her feeling the floor tilt. Let's talk about the house, I said. I reached into my pocket and I took out the brass key and I held it up in the sunlight and I watched Sloane's eyes go to it. A key she'd seen 1,000 times and never once asked what it opened. My father left me this house in 2014, I said. 2 years before I married you. I inherited it. It's titled in my name alone. There's no mortgage. He finished paying it off before he died. In 8 years of marriage, I never once put you on the deed, and no marital money ever went into it because there was nothing left to pay. I turned to Diane. In Ohio, that makes it separate property. It was never half hers to take. It was never on the table at all. Ruth Donnelly has the certified deed and the probate record ready to file with our response. I looked back at Sloan. You've spent 8 years redecorating a house you were never going to get a square foot of. The silence on the porch changed temperature. You could feel it drop. Sloane's mouth opened. My things are in there. My studio equipment. Everything of yours is going with you today. I boxed the studio myself last night, and it's all here. I nodded at the 4 boxes. Which brings me to the studio. And this is the wave that pulled the color right out of her face. The storefront lease is in my name. Personal guarantee. The bank wouldn't take yours, remember? We laughed about it at the time. The line of credit that keeps Maison Sloane's lights on is $82,000. In my name, my signature. The SUV you loaded those boxes into is my cosign, and the payment drafts out of my account on the 3rd of every month. Every card in your wallet is an authorized user on an account that's mine. I said it flat, no relish, the way Ruth read me the statute. The lease renews July 31st. I've already told the bank I won't renew the guarantee. The credit line is maxed and I've stopped feeding it. So at the end of this month, the studio closes. Because there was never a studio, Sloane. There was me, signing, for 10 years, so you could feel like someone. Grant, by the Audi, took his sunglasses off. Sloane, he said, careful now, the way you speak when you feel a floor moving under you. Is that true? The business is... You said the business was yours. She didn't answer him. She was staring at me, and for the first time in 10 years, she was actually looking. Not through me at a checkbook, not past me at a bigger room, looking straight at me. Too late, but at me. Sloane, Grant said again, and the ease had drained out of his voice, replaced by something harder. You told me you owned that business. You told me there was real equity in the house, hundreds of thousands. You said this whole thing would be simple, that you'd walk away with your half, and we'd start fresh. He looked at the 4 boxes on the curb, then at the paid-off house that had never been hers, then at me. And I watched a very intelligent man do very fast arithmetic and land on a number he did not like at all. I rearranged my whole week to be here. I told my partners about you, and now you're telling me there's no house, no business, and $82,000 in debt? Grant, she started. Is it debt or is it not debt, Sloane? Not a question anymore. A man double-checking a figure. She couldn't make herself say it. She just stood there, and her silence was the loudest thing on that porch. Grant slid his sunglasses back on. A small, telling motion, a man quietly closing a folder. And right then, before he ever said a word about calling her later, I knew that whatever Sloane believed she'd secured on the far side of leaving me had just canceled itself in a driveway on Cedar Lane. She'd let go of the rope that held her up to grab a rope that turned out to be tied to nothing at all. I'll tell you the rest in a second, because there's one more thing I said, and it's the thing that turned this whole cold, careful morning into something warm at last, something that healed a wound I'd carried since I was 21 at a graveside. But if you've made it onto this porch with me, I know your chest is doing what mine was doing, so let this one land first before I finish. Diane recovered before her daughter did. Diane always recovers first. You think you're clever, she spat, and the certainty in her voice had a crack in it now. You think a paid-off house and a canceled lease make you a man. You're still a man who lost his job. She's moving up in the world. What are you doing? Where are you going? With your little folder and your little key? And there, bless her, right on cue, she opened the door to wave 3. The last one. The one that was never about money at all. I'm going to Nashville, I said. I start as VP of Operations at Ridgeline Medical the first week of August. More money than Harmon ever paid me. A relocation package, a signing bonus. I signed the offer the last week of June. I turned to Grant and I said it slow, so he'd feel every word find its mark. The same month you texted my wife that she was basically single already. I read it come across her phone. So, no. I was never a gutted, jobless man waiting to sign whatever Sloane slid in front of me. I had a bigger job than the one I lost before she ever served me the papers. I looked back at my wife, and I let the last of it out, and my voice was as steady as I've ever made it. I stayed calm this whole time, Sloane, because I'd already left, weeks ago. In every way that ever mattered, I was already gone. I let you keep planning your clean exit because I wanted you to hear the truth exactly once, out loud, before you told the rest of your life a lie about it. You didn't grow apart from a man with nothing left to give. You let go of the only man who was giving you everything, and you traded him for a bigger number. I truly hope the number's worth what it cost you. Sloane's voice broke. You had a job this whole time. You let me stand here and you let me think. I let you show me who you are. I said. You looked at me the day my income stopped, and you started a stopwatch. Your mother taught you a man is what he provides. And for 10 years, God help me, I believed her too. I thought I was the checkbook. I thought the day I couldn't write the check, there'd be nothing left of me worth staying for. And here's where the calm finally cracked in the open. One time, on purpose, because some things have to be said with the break in them, or they don't count. My father died believing he was only worth his paycheck, I said, and my voice dropped and shook on the word paycheck, and I let it. They lowered him into the ground, and the only thing anyone could think to carve on him was that he was a good provider. I was 21. I stood there and I swore I'd never let it be the only thing they said about me. And then I spent 10 years married to a woman who proved every single day that it was the only thing about me she could see. I buried my father with that word. I am not going to let you bury me with it too. I closed the valve, steady again, and I said the last thing quietly, almost kindly, because by then I meant it more as a diagnosis than a blow. You didn't leave because I had nothing to give, I said. You left because you never once in 10 years asked what I had besides money. That's not my failure, Sloan. It's yours, and you're about to find out how expensive it is. It was Mr. Alvarez who broke the silence from the far side of his roses. He set the hose down on the grass and came to the property line, an old man in a straw hat who'd waved at my father across this same strip of lawn for 30 summers. I knew Ray Lockhart, he said, to Sloan, but loud enough for all of them. Watched him lay those porch steps you're standing on. Watched him pay this house off $1 at a time so his boy would never be without a roof over his head. He looked at her, not unkindly, just plainly. Your husband's cut from the same cloth. I've watched him carry your boxes down to the curb this morning without one hard word. Whatever they're telling you about him in that car. He tipped his head toward the Lexus. It is not the man I've watched on this street. He picked his hose back up and went back to his roses, having said his piece. And I realized my father had one more witness on Cedar Lane than I'd ever known, and that a man's truest eulogy sometimes gets spoken by the neighbor decades early over a fence on a hot July morning. Nobody moved. Mr. Alvarez had long since stopped pretending to water anything. Grant was looking at Sloan the way a man looks at a car he just learned has a salvage title, recalculating the whole purchase. Diane's mouth was a hard, flat line, the creed gone silent in her throat for the first time in her life, because the ledger she'd worshipped for 40 years had just balanced against her own daughter, in the open, on a stranger's porch. And Sloan started to cry. Not the pretty version, the real kind, the kind that comes when a story you've told yourself for years collapses all at once, floor to roof. Miles, she said, it wasn't only the money. I swear it wasn't only 11 days, I said gently. The date's on the filing. It's the one thing here that can't be edited. She had nothing for that. There was nothing to have. And then something happened I hadn't planned for and couldn't have. Sloan turned on her mother. You told me to do it this way, she said, low, shaking. You told me a woman who waits around for love ends up like you. You told me to protect myself, get the house, get the support, be smart about it. You said he'd fold. Her voice climbed. He didn't fold, Mom. There's no house. There's no support. There's a lawyer in a pile of debt with my name on it. And you're standing in his driveway telling me what I'm owed. Diane's mouth opened, and for the first time in the 8 years I'd known her, nothing came out. The creed she'd preached at every holiday table, the sentence she'd handed her daughter like an inheritance, had finally been spoken all the way to its conclusion, out loud, in the daylight. A man is what he provides. And the conclusion was her own daughter standing on a stranger's curb with nothing to her name but the lesson. I did exactly what you taught me, Sloan said, quieter now, and it landed harder for being quiet. And look. Diane looked. She looked at the paid-off house she'd told her daughter to seize, and the surgeon already reaching for his car door, and the husband she'd called dead weight, standing calm on the porch he'd inherited free and clear, and she had no scripture left for any of it. She got into the Lexus. She didn't say goodbye. That was the only mercy in her whole nature. She knew when a ledger had gone permanently red, and she left the table. I almost felt for her. Almost. A woman who'd built her entire life on the belief that money is the only safe thing to love, watching it fail her daughter the exact way love had once failed her. There's a tragedy in that, and I'm not too proud to name it, but I'd spent 10 years living inside the wreckage her lesson made, and I'd used up most of my mercy just keeping my own head above it. If you've ever watched a truth land that another person was betting their whole future on it never surfacing, you know the silence that follows. So before I take you off this porch, let me just say, if you have ever had to hold your dignity together while someone tried to leave you cheap, this next part is for you. Sit with it. That kind of quiet strength is the most underrated thing in the world, and I see you. Here's the part I'm honestly proudest of, more than the deed or the timeline or the job. I kept my promise. I didn't gloat. I didn't call a single friend to crow about it. I didn't type one word onto the internet. Not that day. Not since. This is the first time I've told it, and I've kept the name soft on purpose. I picked up 2 of the 4 boxes myself, and I carried them down my father's porch steps, the ones he laid one summer while I handed him nails, and I set them by the curb. Then I went back for the other 2, and I stacked all 4 neatly at the road where the movers or the surgeon could load them. Call it my anniversary gift to her. I helped my wife leave. Grant didn't touch a single box. He said he'd call her later. The sentence a man uses when the math has changed on him. Got into his Audi and drove off Cedar Lane, and as far as I know, he did call her later, once or twice, and then the calls stopped. The way they do when the assets turn out to be liabilities. Diane loaded the SUV in furious, wordless motion, slamming the hatch harder than any box required. And Sloan stood on the sidewalk in front of the house she'd believed she half owned, wiping her face with the back of her hand, the pale band still bare on her finger, and she looked back at me on the porch one last time. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked. And I understood, even then, even crying, that she meant it about the money. What am I supposed to do now, financially? Her mother's daughter, down to the marrow. "Figure out who you are when nobody's funding it," I said. I had to. It turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I went inside my father's house. I shut the door, I put my back against it, and I stood there in the cool of the hallway. And I breathed, really breathed, for what felt like the first time in 10 years. Let me give you the whole landing, because you've earned it. And because the aftermath kept teaching me things I didn't expect. The divorce finalized in the fall, clean and fast, exactly the way she'd asked for it, just not the way she'd imagined. The house stayed mine. Ruth settled the separate property question with a single letter and a certified copy of the deed, and the other side didn't even push, because there was nothing to push. There was no spousal support. Our earning histories and the 10 years of receipts on her ventures made that request evaporate the moment Ruth laid it out. The $82,000 in studio debt got split in the decree, and Sloan carries her share of it now, which I'm told she is not at peace with. The lease died July 31st on its own, and Maison Sloan went with it. It exists today only as a dormant social account and a lesson. Here's the thing I didn't expect, and it's the truest part of the aftermath. I felt no victory when the papers came. I'd braced for something like triumph, and it never showed up. What showed up instead was quiet, just quiet. And a lot of room in a house that had felt crowded for years with someone who was never really looking at me. I learned later from Wesley's wife that Diane took Sloan back in. 2 women under a rented roof. One hard creed between them, maybe learning together at last that a ledger is a cold thing to sleep next to. I don't wish them harm. I found I don't wish them much of anything anymore, and that surprised me most of all. That's what leaving actually feels like when you do it right. Not hatred, not a fire. Just the quiet after the noise finally stops. There was one more thing, months later, that told me the story had landed exactly where it was always going to land. In the winter, I got a text. Sloan, the first contact since the porch. It was long, and it took her 3 messages to reach the point, but the point, when it arrived, was money. The studio debt had followed her the way I'd told her it would. Collections, her share of the $82,000, and no storefront left to blame it on. "I know things ended badly," she wrote, "but we were married 10 years. I thought maybe you'd help me deal with this, for old time's sake." And then, a minute later, a second message. "You have a good job now. It wouldn't even hurt you. It wouldn't even hurt you." Even then, even after all of it, she reached for me the only way she'd ever known how. as a resource, a balance she could draw against, a provider she'd made the mistake of releasing a little too early. I read those messages standing at the window of my Nashville apartment, my father's toolbox catching the morning light, the brass key in my pocket. And I felt no anger. That was the strangest part of all. I just felt the last thread go slack. I wrote back one message. The debt has your name on the marketing and mine on the note, and the decree split it. I hope you build something real this time, something that's actually yours, but I can't be the ground you stand on anymore. I'm not angry. I'm just done. Take care of yourself, Sloan. Then I did the kindest and hardest thing I know how to do. I blocked the number, not out of spite, but because a boundary you have to keep defending isn't a boundary. It's a door you left open on purpose. I closed the door. She never learned who I was, but I finally did. In the end, that turned out to be the only thing the marriage was ever going to teach me. If you've ever had to walk away from someone who only valued what you produced, and keep your dignity intact while you did it, I would genuinely like to know how you managed it. The comments on this one I keep. Those are the ones I go back and read. I moved to Nashville the first week of August. Wesley drove down with me in a rented truck, sandpaper hands on the wheel, the whole 10 hours, and he carried my father's toolbox up to the new apartment himself and set it by the window where the morning light hits it. Then he cracked 2 beers and handed me one and said, "To Dad, he'd have liked that you finally watched the ceiling instead of the floor." We drank to that, both of us a little wet in the eyes, neither one saying so. Nashville turned out to be everything the quiet had promised. I won't pretend the first months were easy. I ate a lot of dinners alone, learned a new city one wrong turn at a time, and there were nights the apartment felt too big for one man and a toolbox. But the work healed something nothing else could have reached. At Ridgeline, they know me for how I think. Hollis wanders into my office to argue through a problem the way you'd pull up a chair at a good friend's kitchen table. My team brings me the tangles nobody else can unknot because I've got a reputation there already, and it has nothing to do with my salary. 3 months in, Hollis put me in front of the whole regional group to walk them through a fix I'd designed, and afterward a woman from the finance side found me by the coffee and said, "You explain things like you actually want people to understand them. That's rare." I thanked her. In driving home, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Sloan had asked me to explain a single thing I did all day, or wanted to understand it. That's the thing nobody warns you about, being valued for the wrong thing your whole life. You forget there's another way to be seen, until someone does it, and it lands on a part of you that's been starving so long you'd stopped feeling the hunger. I'm not lonely. Exactly. I'm just finally alone in a way that feels like rest instead of exile. Some evenings I take the long way home past the river, and I think about a man in a brown coat, and I say the thing out loud that nobody said at his grave. You were more than the checks, Dad. I know it now. It only took me 33 years and a woman leaving me on our anniversary to learn it. I kept the house on Cedar Lane. I couldn't sell it. My father's hands are in every joist. I rent it now to a young family with a little boy who drew a whole chalk city up the driveway the first week they moved in. Right where my father used to park the truck, right where he died in his coat. I drove past once before I left for Nashville, and I saw that chalk city, and I waited to feel grief, and it didn't come. What came was something like peace. The house was doing the thing a house is for, holding people up the way I'd done for 10 years for someone who never once noticed she was standing on me. I still carry the brass key. I don't know exactly why. I don't need it. The tenants have their own. But it lives in my pocket, worn smooth now by 2 Lockhart hands across 2 generations, and sometimes at my new desk, in my new city, at a job where people know me for how I think and not for what I bank. I put my hand in my pocket and find it there, and I remember. A man is not what he provides. My father was 100 things besides his paycheck, and nobody at that graveside could see even one of them. And I spent 33 years terrified I'd be lowered into the ground under the same single word. It took a woman leaving me on our own anniversary, with her mother in the driveway and a surgeon in the Audi, to finally let me set that word down and walk away lighter than I'd been in my whole adult life. So here's the only thing I know for certain now, the thing I'd give you if I could give you one thing. When somebody shows you they only love the part of you that pays, believe them the very first time. Don't argue. Don't beg. Don't try to become worth more to them. Just pick up the key that's actually yours, the one nobody can take because it was always in your name, and go build a life where you're the whole house and not just the ground somebody else stands on until the day the checks stop. I'm Miles. That's my story. The boxes are gone. The porch belongs to a family with a chalk city now, and for the first time in my life, so does the fear.